Chapter 13. She was in her larger form, of course. Colin couldn't yet be sure whether they defaulted to that out of personal preference or lingering habit from the years of Atraximos's demands. Regardless, it was the only way he could see her directly, now, as even with the cleared paths between the doorways, the main floor of the central chamber was still mired in a mix of priceless timekeeper artifacts and nut bones which drifted higher than he was tall. Wasting no time, Colin focused upon her, and felt the power rise in response. He flickered across the space and appeared at her feet, Tiavathyris having to swivel her head around to peer down at him. That teleportation required him to have a dragon as a point of reference, but could he do more than jump to or away from them? Some experimentation was called for. Later, though. Before he had a chance to speak, Tiavathyris shifted. A convenient trick, husband, she acknowledged, nodding. A knowing, mysterious little smile hovered on her face, which he was starting to suspect was her default expression. "I would not dream of keeping you waiting," Colin replied gallantly. Tiavathyris tilted her head minutely to one side, studying him. "It is as well that you did. Some dragons would take great umbrage at being the last of three chosen to spend time with you in private. Most, in fact." She held up one clawed hand, still smiling. "As I said, husband, it is well. In general, I would advise you to turn to me last whenever such a question of order arises. I am not interested in playing such games, and more pointedly, Iziaroa and Amaralafine share a rivalry which frequently impairs their ability to act their age. It might be wise to alternate which of the two is chosen first. They will definitely be keeping count." "I have the feeling," he said fervently, "that I have just barely begun to understand how much I should appreciate your calm temper, my lady wife. Let me assure you that I have at least made an earnest start." "You are quick with a turn of phrase," she said, her smile widening subtly. "Come, then, let us move to more suitable surroundings." Okay, it was back to courtship mode then. Colin deliberately schooled his features into a smile, a carefully constructed one, warm and benign, with just a hint of seductive heat. He held out his hand to her, bowing slightly. Tiavathyris studied him, inscrutable. After a second, her smile seemed to warm by just a hair, and she took his hand. Strange how quickly the feeling of cool scales against his fingers had become familiar. He reflected, as they strolled down the entry tunnel, that another benefit of leaving her till last was that this seemed likely to be the biggest challenge yet. Iziaroa and Amaralafine both had large personalities, and both were keenly interested in intimacy, though Amaralafine seemed to have an issue about admitting that to herself. She certainly wouldn't admit it to him, but her physical response had been far too avid for someone tolerating his advances for ulterior reasons, as their agreement suggested. Tiavathyris, though. He had almost no read on her. She had rather openly expressed interest, and yet was so calm, aloof, contained. Not understanding what she liked or wanted made this seriously difficult. It would be far too easy to do exactly the wrong thing. Worse, filling in the gaps in his perception of her would be a long and equally challenging process. People who held themselves apart were the most difficult to get to know. But then they emerged into her chambers, and Colin came to a stop alongside her, taking it all in. Atraximos had chosen to live in a museum. Though he hadn't yet seen Amaralafine's personal lair, the library she had constructed displayed much of her personality. The chamber of Tiavathyris was just as much a testament to its occupant, yet while nothing he saw surprised him, Colin had the strong feeling it would be some time yet before he understood her well enough to read meaning into all this. Unlike the others, even Amaralafine's library, she had completely remodeled to the extent of installing walls over the ancient timekeeper stonework. That also had the effect of covering the Temeglas insets and stifling the chamber's built-in illumination, so that what he beheld now was dimly lit by hanging lamps. These flickered a smoky orange like natural fire, but were surely magical, if only because changing the oil in them would be an ongoing, meticulous nightmare, and Colin knew enough about dragons at this point to know they would never bother. The walls seemed to be enormous panels of patterned silk in a deep green that matched their scales, separated by towering columns of intricately wrought. That couldn't be solid gold, surely. They were at least plated in gold, forming the shapes of dragons twining along each column. Even if it was a thin veneer, the wealth on display was staggering to the imagination. She had further altered the shape of the room with elevated sections along the walls, supported by more golden pillars glimmering in the dim firelight. If he didn't know the layout of these ancient chambers already, Colin could believe they were part of the original construction, so apparently solid were they. He also appreciated the use of space. In addition to the elevated sections providing just as much floor space, the area beneath them would serve nicely for divided rooms for storage, and would be quite spaciously tall even for a dragon in her bipedal form. Strange how the subdivision of the room made it seem even bigger than the one in which Atraximos had laid out his museum. You approve? Colin realized he'd been gaping around like a fool. Tiavathyris was now looking down at him with that same amused, aloof expression. I can't imagine that my approval matters, he said, rallying with a similarly coy smile, but even so, this is majestic. While I would hardly redecorate to suit you, husband, your opinion is certainly not meaningless to me. I am pleased that you like it. Come, this way. I am at your disposal, Colin said gallantly as he let her tug him along the central aisle between the elevated sections. Up ahead, they terminated to leave an open space in roughly the middle of the chamber. The cleared area they were approaching, he noted, was slightly elevated and made of something beige. Is it too soon to inquire what this is about? We must begin your training, Tiavathyris stated, which will necessarily begin with an assessment. Training. I got the impression from the Mahalaphine that not enough is understood about godlings in general for there to be a known training program. I wouldn't know, though I'm inclined to trust her expertise on the subject of gods and magic. No, husband, my intentions are more specific. Tell me, Arkansas Colin, what experience do you have in fighting? Oh. Of course. Tiavathyris was a legendary warrior. Though she was not even from this continent, records of her exploits were known and told, and they were all of battles fought against mighty foes. Colin had the sudden, sinking epiphany that nothing about himself was likely to impress her. Well, damage control, then. Best not to dissemble, she definitely wouldn't respect that. None, he stated. Well, I suppose not actually none. I've never heard of a child who didn't get into scuffles now and then. But not since I was a child, and that was just, you know, childish flailing. I suspect it wouldn't even count as fighting to your standards. Anything and everything counts, she said. When a contest of wills extends into the physical, battle is joined. It is then only a question of how well one fights. Really, husband, nothing. A healthy young man like yourself? They had arrived at the intersection of paths with its broad cleared space, and she now turned to face him directly, releasing his hand and studying him with exactly the same expression. He couldn't read her at all. He did, however, note that the light tan surface was elevated because the edges of the many panels of which it was composed were rounded and stitched at their corners, like some sort of upholstery or leather. Of course, a soft surface sized for a dragon would make a perfect sleeping place for her, and neatly double as a sparring ring for people of human proportions. How oddly elegant. I was a scribe, he said, shrugging and keeping his own careful smile in place. Not just by vocation. Orphans and Revcabit are often fostered by the Regency as apprentices for public service positions. I was raised in the Royal Archives, under the very strict understanding that civilized people solve differences with words, not fists. A fine sentiment, she agreed, nodding, though one reflecting an unfortunately narrow understanding of the world. It fails to account for the omnipresence of less civilized people who will not yield to argumentation. Sure, of course. I'm not trying to belittle the martial arts, it's just where I was brought up. There were people whose job it was to protect the likes of me from the likes of those less than civilized sorts. Guards, soldiers, who had subsequently thrown him in a prison on the trumped-up say-so of someone better positioned than he had been to sway them with words. Colin kept that thought behind his teeth, uncertain whether it supported his argument or hers. There is an old proverb of which I am fond, Avatar is said with another mysterious little smile. As a scribe, you may have heard it yourself. The society that separates its warriors from its scholars will have its thinking done by cowards, and its fighting by fools. I haven't heard that one, Colin admitted, but I already like it. Well, consider the point conceded. There are other reasons to value the martial arts, she continued. They teach an awareness of the body, and a mastery of its use, that are not otherwise achievable, and this is of paramount value to anyone who intends to go through life in a physical form. But, am I not one of the very few for whom that isn't a concern anymore? Imar Alafin gave me the impression that my progress from here on would be mostly toward ascending beyond physical form. She is correct, but the benefits of which I speak come with corresponding spiritual and mental advantages which will be valuable to you regardless, husband. Besides, as I am sure she told you, the nature of your experience from now on will determine the nature of the God you become. I have not Imar Alafin's expertise, but I know that much of godlings. I will not be party to the creation of a deity who does not know and respect the value of martial mastery. Do not fear, Colin, I have no intention of turning you into a creature of violence. No one knows better than I the repugnance of such. Rather, the arts in which I mean to train you are a path specifically to maintaining poise and serenity no matter what violence may surround you. And besides, she lifted one hand, gently bringing the claw of her forefinger to rest under his chin, unnecessarily nudging his face up toward hers. At least she used the side of the claw, not the tip. Her smile took on more than a hint of a smirk. I have accepted you as my husband, Arkansas Colin, as my lord and master. I require that the male to whom I belong be nothing less than a paragon in all things. A dragon's pride demands it. Well, he said, smiling back with exactly the same hint of smirk and not moving to dislodge her claws, there's no arguing with that, is there? My training is in your hands, then. This had not been what he had had in mind when he followed her in here. They were going to spar? Hopefully she was right about those mental benefits of martial arts, or he had a feeling he knew who his least favorite wife was going to be. Colin had chatted with guards around the Regency, even seen some of their training. He was not optimistic. Training later, she corrected. First, assessment. That you have no experience in the craft of combat is noted, but there is a level of physical ability beyond that which must be considered. I do note, husband, that you do not have the frame of someone who has lived a soft life. The Lord Scribe insisted we get some exercise daily. Nothing major, just some stretches and light calisthenics. He always said a truly nimble mind couldn't exist in a decaying body. A wise man, she said, nodding with clear approval. The pang that shot through Colin truly tested his ability to keep emotions well clear of his face. The Lord Scribe had been a mentor, really the closest thing to a parent he'd had. And then he had thrown Colin to the crocodiles the second it became politically inconvenient to do otherwise. Fattest man I've ever seen, Colin replied, continuing to marshal his expression. He likes his food rich and plentiful. Always joined in with the morning exercises, though. He could run amazingly fast, and I never saw him get out of breath no matter how many stairs he climbed. The outward signs of physical fitness can be deceptive, she agreed. But I am far more interested in you than your erstwhile employer, husband. I'm definitely in better shape now than I would have been in the archives, he admitted. A year of hiking all over the landscape will do that for a guy. Yes, you do give the impression of a frame whose softness has been burned away. Avatar slightly brushed his cheek with the back of her claws, then continued to stroke them gently along his shoulder, and down his upper arm. Her expression was an odd mix of gentle and analytical. He just couldn't read her. the effects of exertion and deprivation do resemble those of training, if only superficially. Yours looks more like a body shaped by the former than the latter. However, you also move with care and purpose, not in the manner of a warrior, but... Do you dance, Arkansas Colin? I do, he said, raising his eyebrows in surprise. Heavens uncounted, you can tell that? I can make educated guesses, she said, smiling languidly. It is apparent from your gait that you have been taught poise, you walk more like a nobleman than a scribe. Another pang, which he controlled better. Yes, I suppose I have had a rather interesting life, even before meeting you. I was the beneficiary of some specific coaching, before I left Rivkabit. More in the social than the martial arts, however. These things do interact, she said, nodding. Nothing in isolation. Very well, you are far from a hopeless student, unless you display a degree of sudden ineptitude that I frankly do not expect. It beggars my credulity that you could have made it thus far alive, were you excessively clumsy. I did have a golden opportunity to stumble right into a Traximos's nose recently, he said gravely. I struggle to guess which of you would have found it less amusing. Now, where is? Ah. As she spoke, a prickle ran through his senses, alerting him to another draconic presence. This was still a weird sensation, but one to which he was growing accustomed. She entered through the main door to the central air outside, in full-sized form. Vadaril she stalked down the aisle, wings folded behind her, green eyes fixed intently on Colin now. You are not late, daughter, Tevathyris stated flatly, but only barely. I did ask for your timely presence this morning. And I would never dream of keeping you waiting, mother, the younger dragon simpered, much less the esteemed Mr. Pants, here. Tevathyris blinked her eyes slowly, once. Mr. Pants. Really, Vadaril she? I can live with it. Colin shrugged when both dragons turned to stare at him. It's a universal law that nobody gets to pick their own nickname. I don't love that one, but I also don't hate it, which makes me think I should bear this with good grace lest it get any worse. Well, I gather an archive is not totally unlike a barracks, if you've acquired that piece of wisdom so young, Tevathyris said, amused. And what an accommodating young man he is. Vadaril she said sweetly. She grinned, and Colin was extremely certain that the expression was not meant to be reassuring. How's your nose? He asked innocently, causing her smirk to immediately vanish. Any spinal damage? That looked painful. Nothing actually harmful has happened to me within recent memory, thank you for your concern, the young dragon stated flatly. Vadaril she, her mother said, even more flatly. Did something occur? I had a slight mishap in flight outside, she said, raising her long neck to stare down at them from a greater height. Tevathyris, of course, was not in the least intimidated by this. Somewhat to his own surprise, Colin found that he wasn't either. On one level, to be sure, he was witnessing the posturing of an armored monster big enough to snap him in half. But also, the posturing of a teenager who was one careless word from getting in hot water with her mother. A mishap, Tevathyris repeated, folding her arms. You? I am sure that must be an interesting story. It's not, Vadaril she said quickly. Not even an anecdote. Really? Colin said, giving her his most benign smile. That surprises me. Do you often plow face first into solid walls? I have to say, you seem a lot more graceful than that, generally. The young dragon hissed at him. Colin found it interesting that she did it more like a cat than a snake, jaws wide open, producing the rasp of air in the back of her throat rather than at the lips. It was certainly a more frightening spectacle, but he was growing increasingly secure in his physical safety around rambunctious dragons. Vadaril she, Tevathyris snapped, and the younger dragon immediately ceased, and flattened herself to the floor. Even with her chin resting on the ground, her huge eyes were almost level with Colin's. In fairness, he said lightly, it would have been hard to evade a solid wall that suddenly appeared right in front of her. Tiavatharis closed her eyes, and softly growled. Well, softly for a dragon. The basso intensity of the sound that emerged from her slender throat was far more terrifying coming from her than any of her daughter's antics had been. I have long since grown weary of admonishing you not to antagonize Imahalafine, you obstreperous tadpole, the elder dragon stated, baring her teeth. I am perilously close to weariness with allowing her the privilege of correcting your behavior. If you think she has an excessively firm hand, be assured that mine is not restrained by her desire to avoid stepping on my tail. Vedaral, she lay flat on the floor, making huge tragic eyes at them from her predatory reptilian visage. The spectacle was surreally adorable. Tiavatharis glared at her in silence for an uncomfortably long span of seconds, before finally snorting. Enough. I summoned you here for a reason, daughter. I will address your ongoing idiocy later. If you manage to make yourself sufficiently useful and minimally obnoxious for the duration, I will take it into account. Shift, now. Colin had just barely managed not to grin with glee at the sight of Vedaralshi's tail beginning to wag at the promise of potential forgiveness, but at that last command she froze, then raised her head in an expression of confusion. Shift. You mean? You know what I mean. We are blessedly free of your father's stubborn preoccupations. I will of course not begrudge your use of the greater form if you favor it, but there will be no more neglecting the lesser, particularly when it has a specific use. Now, please. She obeyed, and in the next second was standing before them, bipedal. Colin's first thought was that there wasn't much of her father in Vedaralshi's humanoid face. If anything, she strongly resembled a much younger Tiavatharis. She had the same bronze skin, angled eyes and sculpted cheekbones. Even her hair was the same shade of green, though cut much shorter and messy as if she'd just risen from bed. Her black horns were also shorter. She was a bit more conservatively dressed than her mother, in a kilt and fabric binding around her chest that left most of her midsection and shoulders exposed, but still less than Tiavatharis's outfit. Colin had to wonder if that was because she didn't have as much to show off. The younger dragon was far slimmer than the elder's hourglass shape. Between that and her somewhat softer features, she just looked adolescent. He had to actively remind himself she was over a century old, and that treating her like the 15-year-old she resembled was sure to piss her off. Something in the set of her eyes when she shifted them to stare at him suggested she was thinking along similar lines. Good, Tiavatharis said briskly. Husband, daughter, step toward the middle of the ring, if you would. Remember, our purpose here is simply to assess. She will attack, and I will carefully observe how you handle it. There is no need to be concerned with winning, Arkansas Colin. Ooh. Vedaralshi's whole face positively lit up, and she squeezed her own claws as if cracking her knuckles, which they apparently didn't. Don't worry, Pants, I'll go easy on you. Colin stared at her for a second, then sighed. No, you won't. She cackled. No, I won't. Chapter 14. Colin stepped carefully onto the platform, testing the effect of its soft surface. Actually, it wasn't that bad, plenty firm enough to provide good footing, just yielding enough to mitigate injury if one were to fall on it, which was undoubtedly the point. In Revkabit, the guard training areas he'd seen were covered in sand. This seemed better. I assume my shoes won't be an issue on the padding, he said aloud, since apparently her claws aren't. Vedaralshi had already hopped up alongside him, and now bounced lightly on her talons, grinning. She should have shredded any such material with every step, but the padding seemed unaffected. It's enchanted to the last hell and back, she explained, hopping back and forth now from one talon to the others. Most everything in here is, Pants, don't you worry your little head about it. I actually am a little concerned, Colin said. I seem to be able to control or dismantle enchantments laid by dragons. Vedaralshi actually froze, peering at him warily now. Does this happen accidentally? Tiavatharis asked, her own gaze sharpening. Not so far, he said, turning to her. It takes some concentration. So, no, It probably won't be a problem. It's just that all this is new and I don't have a thorough handle yet on how it all works. I'm trying to be cautious." "Wise and appreciated," she replied, inclining her head. "Please inform me, husband, if this ability seems to slip out of your control. Otherwise." As she said, "I have made heavy use of magic to preserve and enhance many elements of my decor. While I do not display my most valued treasures at the forefront of the collection, as some dragons do, I wish for no disruption of my living space. That, in addition to the customary preference of dragons not to have their belongings tampered with. To be clear, Arkansas Colin, the only thing in here which is yours to touch without express invitation is me." What an absolutely fascinating way to phrase that. Colin forced himself to put the implications aside. Despite the intriguing wording, Tevathyris's tone and expression conveyed only a stern warning. "Noted," he said, inclining his head graciously, "but for the record, unnecessary. I assure you I would never so disrespect you as to rummage through your belongings." "Good," she said with a smile. In his peripheral vision, she grimaced and rolled her eyes. Colin was starting to feel fatalistic about her. If she was already over 100 years old, how much longer should he expect her to act like a bratty teenager? This was going to get old real fast. "Then let us begin. There should be no need to restrain yourself, but this is also not the time to exercise your full skill. Remember that the objective is to gauge Arkansas Colin's status and abilities, not for you to show off." She didn't even give him the courtesy of a warning. All he registered was her fiendish grin before she launched herself across the mat at him. Moving faster than he ever had in his life, Colin grabbed her by the wrist and flung her over his shoulder and across the room. She landed upright on her claws, too nimble to be knocked down by a simple throw, but there she stopped a few paces away, frowning at him in consternation. Colin froze, his brain still catching up to what had just happened. "Interesting," Tevathyris murmured. "Well? Proceed." Still frowning, she came at him again, but more carefully this time. Rather than committing to a full-body charge, she danced within range, claws lashing out at him. Colin should by all rights have been helpless against that, even if her hands weren't tipped and flesh-ripping talons. Her other talons had the same effect on her height as it did the other dragons, and towering over him gave her a greater reach. And yet, he swatted aside her probing attacks with lightning-quick movements of his own hands, while incongruously stumbling gracelessly backward to regain some space. She denied him this, continuing to press in. Jabbing, swiping, her claws came at him from multiple angles, to no effect each time. What Colin couldn't deflect, he dodged with ease. She was scowling in frustration now. Despite his own inexperience, Colin could note one difference between her technique and any human fighting he'd ever seen. Rather than making fists or using the sides or palms of her hands to hit, she came at him with claws. Apparently dragon martial arts were a thing, or maybe it was something developed by another race with similar anatomy. No human would try to attack with her fingertips this way. She suddenly changed her entire approach, kicking him for the first time. It did no more good than anything else. Colin blocked her strike without effort, and the sight of that enormous talon bouncing helplessly off his own bare forearm was downright surreal. Growling openly now, she lashed out with several more quick kicks. Colin blocked one, evaded two more, and then when she tried for a distance-closing snap kick right into his center of mass, he grabbed her ankle and spun, again flinging her away. Again she failed to go down, though this time she had to land in a crouch with one hand on the mat and her tail sticking straight out to regain her balance. At least she was out of range again. "Enough," Tevathyris said quietly. "He cheated," she accused, angrily lashing her tail. "Child, shut up," her mother said wearily. "You and I will discuss the layered and nuanced stupidity of that statement later, when I am not in the middle of something important. I know we discussed this already, husband, but please indulge me with a reiteration. You are certain you have never trained in fighting?" I am absolutely certain, he said. Also, for context, I have never moved like that before, and I'm still not sure how I did. So you would describe those movements as involuntary reactions? That's a perfect word, yes. I'm sure it was still a laughable display by your standards, but it does seem to have worked. I, too, have rarely seen anyone move like that, said Tiavathyres, a faint indentation appearing between her eyebrows. Apparently her frowns were as understated and mysterious as her smiles. Yes, I could see your overall physical ineptitude, but when deflecting. In a way, that was the ultimate in hand-to-hand combat, the final perfection toward which the greatest masters only aspire. No technique, no style, no form whatsoever, only movement. Small, perfect movements, enough to accomplish precisely their given task, unexpressed even by the rest of the body to which the moving limb was connected. I do not actually know of any martial artist who has achieved this through their own efforts. I have, however, seen the like a few times. Magical effects which render a person unbeatable in physical combat are incredibly rare, but such things have existed now and then. Wait, so he just automatically wins every fight now? Vedaralshi protested. That's bullshit. I don't think so, Colin said slowly, frowning himself now. Imaralafine is pretty sure all my powers are dragon-focused, and from what I've seen firsthand, she's probably right. So, I think I just can't lose a fight to a dragon. Equally bullshit. Vedaralshi complained. And difficult to test, Tiavathyres murmured, as we have nothing but dragons against whom to test you, husband. I have a feeling that the changes inevitably coming upon our life as a result of your presence will widen our social circle somewhat. I am not, however, eager to bring more strangers into our home and our business. We must protect these secrets as long as we are able. What about a golem or automaton? Vedaralshi suggested. You could probably make something like that, mother. Even if it's too much finicky magic, I bet Amy can. Imaralafine is certainly capable of such a feat, yes, and even I might be if I put my mind to it. But this hypothetical automaton would then be a magical construct created by a dragon, to which, I gather, the same stipulation applies. You are certain, Arkansas Colin, that that's how it works? Well, it matches everything I've been able to test, said Colin, and then teleported. He zipped right over to Vedaralshi and flicked the tip of her nose, then vanished again as she howled and swiped at him in outrage. This time landing in front of Tiavathyres, he gently tapped a fingertip against her lips, a gesture which she permitted with a faint smile and no attempt to stop him. Then he ported again, directly behind Vedaralshi to step lightly on the tip of her tail, and finally over behind Tiavathyres. She moved with far more speed and poise than her daughter. Colin arrived to find her already twisted around and with her hand outstretched such that he practically materialized in her grasp. Rather than retaliating or evading, he instead reached up to grasp her open claw and leaned forward, pressing a chaste little kiss to her palm. All of this, again, she permitted with a smile, having clearly demonstrated her ability not to submit to any of it did she not so wish. Then he teleported one last time, arriving back on the sparring mats at a suitably safe distance from the fuming Vedaralshi. It requires a dragon as a point of reference, Colin explained. I can move to a dragon, or away from one. Even behind one, as you just saw. In terms of magical movement, it's like there's an invisible line between me and every dragon in my vicinity, extending beyond them. I can teleport to anywhere along that line. But nowhere else. I can't just jump around freely wherever I want. Absolutely fascinating, Tiavathyres mused, studying him with her eyes narrowed in thought. The options would perforce be more complex than points on a line, presuming that you were able to evade any attack a dragon launched at you, or strike them from any direction, as you must be, for that ability to make the slightest sense. But the focus is clear, and for our purposes that is what matters. She trailed off, frowning at the distance and slowly rubbing her thumb along her fingertips, creating a soft rhythmic clatter of claw on claws. She folded her arms and made a face at Colin. His instinct was to leave Tiavatharis alone to think, or whatever else she wanted to do, but standing here with she leering at him was quickly becoming excruciating. He cleared his throat, and then when it got no response, prompted her aloud. "How, then, would you like to proceed?" Tiavatharis's eyes flicked back to him, focusing, and she deliberately relaxed her stance. "First, I must consider. Obviously, actually training you will be difficult. It will take substantial effort to devise a method which will work at all. I must think carefully on the possibilities, and consult with certain resources. In the meantime, it's not as if you are unable to train at all, husband. I will devise an exercise routine for you. Now that I have an eye for how well you move, both unassisted and when your powers impel you, I know the majority of what I need to. For the rest, I'll speak with Imam Al-Afin about the physical capabilities and needs of a godling. This will be the easier part. It should not take long. Unless some new hiccup emerges, I should have a schedule laid out for you by tomorrow, husband. For now, resume the light exercises you spoke of. Anything sufficient to keep a scribe's body from decaying should suffice for the short term." "Very well, that's a good idea," Colin agreed, nodding. "I'll find time to do that today, not that that should be difficult. It isn't as if my schedule is exactly packed. What should I expect in the days to come? Or is it too early to guess?" "It is early for the specifics, but generally, I will definitely not train you as hard as I would a prospective warrior." She smiled, her eyes flicking up and down him once. "Both because you seem unlikely to become one, or need to, and because of your unique situation. A true regimen of training that would bring a scribe up to my standards of physical fitness is purposely traumatizing. The entire objective is to break down the mind, the routine, the relationship of the brain to the body, just as it does the muscles, so they can grow back bigger. You now have the lifespan that allows us to proceed more slowly, and more importantly, I'm hesitant to subject you to a degree of pain and deprivation that might turn you into something with which I would not want to live." How worried should I be about that?" she demanded. "Do we need to handle this guy with kid gloves? 'Cause I'll tell you right now, I don't see that working out with the others. Venomax thinks with his claws and Fenurix's brain is full of snark and pranks." "Worry about yourself, daughter," Tiavatharis ordered, fixing her with a firm stare. "No, we should specifically not handle him with kid gloves, but do not attempt to play with Arkansas Colin as roughly as you would your siblings. We shall all have to find a happy medium, together." Well, Colin suddenly realized, if that was her agenda settled, that still left his own. He didn't exactly prefer to pursue this with she standing right there, but best not to leave his intentions unclear, that could be trouble later. The girl could handle seeing a little flirting, and if not, she'd better get used to it. "I will eagerly look forward to that happy medium, then." Tiavatharis's eyes fixed on him, and he zeroed his own attention in upon her in return, suddenly the hunter with his prey in sight. Colin stepped forward to the edge of the mats at a slow, controlled pace, keeping his expression equally controlled, warm and just a bit mischievous, that well-practiced smile that was just shy of a smirk. Even his gaiety moderated to a rolling amble, grateful not for the first time today for Hector's vigorous coaching in the art of charisma. Reaching the edge of the platform, he stopped. It wasn't tall enough to put his eyes on her level, but less disadvantageous than being on the floor. Colin bowed to her, holding eye contact and holding that perfect smile, then allowing one corner of his lips to rise a smidge further, warming the sly expression. "I look forward to a great deal, my lady wife. Without doubt, I am in the best of hands." He reached out to gently take her hand again and raise it for a kiss, all the while giving her that smoky look up through his lashes, and ignoring the gagging sounds she made. Tiavatharis's mysterious little smile faded. A prickle of unease ran through Colin. "What? Did she not like? But that didn't make sense. She'd been overtly signaling her interest, starting that morning in the bath, and then with that comment about touching and permission. Unbidden, his focus sharpened, and he found himself as aware of her as he would have been of a dragon moving to attack him. Not able to read her thoughts, but the burst of insight gave him a second-hand feeling of her emotions, her intent. That low simmer of disappointment? Boredom, threaded with mild frustration. Tiavatharis withdrew her hand from his, not roughly but implacably, and took a step back. It goes without saying. Thank you, husband, for your cooperation. This has been an auspicious start. I will have the next steps for you soon. Her expression had gone still, her body language poised and neutral. That was an obvious dismissal, which left him little option but to leave, unless he wanted to begin actively irritating her. Which, obviously, he did not. Colin contented himself for now with slipping into a similar poise. Reserved and polite, he nodded to her. The gratitude is mine, Tiavatharis. Till next time, then. Deliberately radiating calm, he stepped down, then past her, and strode down the aisle toward the door, at no point positioning himself to risk catching a glimpse of Vadaralshi's expression. Inwardly, silently, he seethed. How had he screwed it up? What went wrong? Iziaroa and Imaralafine had both eaten up that routine, and the latter while refusing to admit to herself that she liked it. He knew Tiavatharis was into him, she had been extremely unsubtle about it. Something had changed. He'd done something to turn her off, but damned if he could figure out what. His performance had been perfect, even Hactrio would have given him full marks. Well, Colin reflected as he paced down the corridor toward the central chamber, which he could already smell. 2 out of 3 wasn't a terrible start. There had to be some kind of in with Tiavatharis. He just needed more information. He needed to observe her, figure out her wants and needs and general personality, ideally without letting on that he was doing it. And quickly. His position here would rapidly become untenable if she decided she didn't care for his company after all. Which meant, by every nameless and uncounted hell in alphabetical order, he was gonna have to schmooze Vadaralshi a bit. Oh, that should be fun. Lost in his thoughts, Colin was halfway across the vast central chamber, navigating the paths between rotting bone piles without really having a plan for where he was going, when his distracted attention was suddenly seized. There was a dragon focusing on him, coming at him fast, in fact. And this one was definitely hostile. He felt the surge of killing intent, backed by blazing frustration and fury, before he even heard the roar. Definitely before Vanamax came charging out of the front corridor. The black and red dragon launched himself with a beat of his wings the instant he had cleared the entry hall and had enough space to open them. He didn't actually take flight, as there would barely be room for it even in here, but used the force to launch himself halfway across the room in one single bound. Vanamax slammed to the ground directly in front of Colin, causing an enormous clatter as old bones were crushed beneath him and sprayed in all directions, even at Colin, who reflexively raised both arms to cover his face. Several bounced off him with no ill effect. Apparently his anti-dragon defenses worked at least one step removed. So a dragon couldn't get around it by just chucking something at him. That was handy. It was funny the things that came to mind in a moment like that. For some reason, Colin found himself taking particular note of the fact that he felt nothing through his feet from the impact. A creature this size, landing that hard, that close, should have shaken the ground almost like an earthquake. The impervious timestone didn't even vibrate. "Hi, Vanamax," he said loud, tilting his head back to gaze up at the dragon who was now looming menacingly over him. Claws flexed, jaws slightly parted to show off teeth, and his mouth flickering with the first hints of incipient flame. "Something on your mind?" "Arkansas Colin's liquor," Vanamax roared. "I challenge you for rule of this family. You, me, right now, to the death." Chapter 15. It seemed strange that Colin's first and strongest reaction was confusion. Not that being towered over by an aggressive dragon was not viscerally alarming on a deep, animal level, but even that wasn't the reaction that most preoccupied his mind. Maybe it was because he was growing accustomed to dragons, maybe because he was just accustomed to suppressing those instinctive reactions. In fact, it was probably both, plus the comparison between Venomax and Atraximos didn't favor Venomax. His father had been able to project terrifying menace with complete self-control, making this display of temper look almost clownish by comparison. But mostly, in that moment, Colin found himself confused as to just what this dragon was trying to accomplish. "I'm sorry, you what?" he said politely. Venomax spat a swift burst of fire over him, which of course did nothing save to char some of the surrounding bones. "Are you deaf, or merely stupid? Whichever is the most pitiable, I'm sure that is at issue." "Hey, now, that's a pretty insensitive thing to say," Colin said severely, frowning. "I used to work regularly with a deaf scholar. She was among the kindest." The dragon thrust his head forward, close enough that Colin could see right down his throat to the fiery glow therein, and roared. It should have been absolutely deafening. The wind alone was enough to flatten his hair back. Apparently anti-dragon powers also protected his eardrums from dragon-produced sounds. His next realization was that he was making this worse. Colin already knew, from his encounters with several ill-mannered individuals in his youth, that somebody already worked into a temper would only be antagonized more by a calm and measured response. The Lord Scribe had explained to him that it made their lashing out look ridiculous by comparison, and making them feel ridiculous would only make them angrier. The more so if there was an audience. Which there now was. It had taken barely any time at all for every other dragon present to emerge from their lairs into the central hall to watch this. All of them, of course, in their full-sized reptilian forms. "Venomax," Izyroa snapped, stalking forward. Tiavatharis cleared her throat loudly. "A challenge has been issued, Izyroa. Intervention from any of us is not appropriate." "Yes, by all means, let's see how this plays out," Imaralafine added, grinning. Izyroa shifted her head to glare at her, but rather than lashing out at Imaralafine, redirected her focus. "Husband, please." "It's all right," Colin assured her. "Oh, is it?" Venomax snarled, clawing at the floor and recapturing Colin's own attention. "We all saw what you did to Atraximos. I know very well you can blast me to dust with a thought. Do it, then, if you dare." "I am categorically not going to do that," Colin stated calmly. "I'm sure it would grieve your mother terribly, and her happiness is deeply important to me." "Uh-huh." Venomax's grin was now as self-satisfied as it was furious, which Colin knew to be a very unstable combination of emotions. "Then it seems we shall learn what use a scribe of Rivkablet is in proper battle." Oh. So that was his plan. He lashed out with a front leg, his clawed hand longer than Colin's entire chest. Colin could feel it coming, since the intent. Time itself seemed to slow, giving him ample time to formulate a response. He could easily dodge this, or deflect it, or retaliate. The inner glow of his power swelled, whispering seductively, urging him to use it. Colin didn't need its urging. He had already decided what to do. He stood there and took it. Venomax's talons slapped against him and rebounded as harmlessly as if he had tried to rake a time-stone wall. From somewhere behind Colin came a feminine snort of amusement. He wasn't sure whether it was Fenurixa or Vaidarlshi, but it wasn't one of the elders. "Ah," he said aloud, nodding. "You're not just lashing out, this is a strategy. Your pardon, Venomax, I underestimated you. However, you seem to have misunderstood how this god of dragons thing works." "You are the god of nothing," Venomax bellowed, rearing up and flaring his wings. "Nor shall you grow to be." He lunged back down, clamping his jaws around Colin and jerking his head to fling him across the room. The only really bad part about it was that his breath at that proximity was not pleasant. Even that wasn't so very terrible, though. It wasn't a whole lot worse than the smell of this room in general. Having failed to move Colin an inch, Venomix released him and lifted his head again, staring down in confused frustration. Bones flew as he lashed his tail once. So, these anti-dragon powers even prevented a dragon from picking him up with hostile intent? It seemed they weren't even pretending to respect basic physics anymore. This was starting to verge on the comical. Well, this wasn't going to help his relationship with Venemax any, but with the entire rest of the family present and watching, it was an opportunity for Colin to display the trait he apparently needed to most, and the one that came least naturally to him, dominance. I'll tell you what, Venemax. You know the weight of your dignity better than I, so would it be less humiliating if I pound you senseless, or stand here ignoring you until you tire yourself out? I am willing to accommodate you at least that far. The roar which answered him contained another ineffectual blast of fire, and an even greater rage than before. Fight me like something resembling a man, you sniveling insect. As you wish. It was surprisingly easy, despite him never having done it before. It was coded right into his instincts, now. He reached out with his mind, sensing and seizing the enormous wellspring of energy that was Venomix's being. Colin could feel the opportunity, sense how he could push into it, swelling and dispersing it until Venomix burst like a soap bubble, just as he'd done to Atraximos. He was very careful only to observe this possibility, directing no thought into carrying it out. Instead, he grabbed the dragon's essence in a far more physical sense. Just as he himself was impervious to a dragon's strength, Colin found that he could command a dragon's very presence in three-dimensional space without tampering with her inner being. Faster than Venemax could react, he was lifted straight upward until he slammed into the ceiling hard enough to drive the breath from him and a weak puff of smoke. Colin immediately released him, taking a judicious step back as the dazed dragon plummeted back to the floor. Bones clattered in every direction, but again the time stone didn't even quiver as Venomix hit the ground hard enough to rattle his skull even further. "Are we done, then?" he asked politely. It took Venomix's eyes a second to focus back on him, but this was followed immediately by a snarl. He surged back to his feet, roaring, "You little..." Rather than indulging any more of this, Colin once again seized him with his mind, this time, by the tail. Venomix squawked in protest as he was whipped bodily around and hurled, slamming into one wall. "Stop!" Colin yanked him across the room, smacking him into the other wall, and then the floor, and then the ceiling again. This time he fell at an angle, sprawling awkwardly on one wing with an undignified yelp. "Yikes, Vaderil," she commented, and then Colin winced in sympathy, belatedly realizing he'd dropped Venomix right on a collection of the indestructible timekeeper gadgets poking up through the mess of bones. "Are we done now?" he asked, injecting impatience into his tone. Dragons were resilient creatures, it seemed, even proportional to their size and strength. That did not seem to have done much real damage. Colin was pretty sure he'd be dealing with multiple broken bones and lacerations after similar treatment, or, well, a normal human would. He wasn't so sure about himself anymore. Venemax, though moving more stiffly now, managed to scrabble his way back upright. He roared and lunged at Colin again, and this time Colin smashed him straight downward, pressing him into the floor. It was as easy as holding a thought in the forefront of his mind. Venemax was forced down by constant pressure, as if gravity's hold on him alone had increased tenfold. And then more. He started attempting to struggle forward, and Colin effortlessly cranked up the intensity until he could scarcely keep breathing, much less move. "I am not going to kill you, Venemax," he stated. "I'm trying not to cause you any real injury, either, though if I do, I might be able to heal it. That'll be an interesting thing to test. However, that isn't the point right now. Yield." Venemax found the strength to draw back his lips and growl. "This is not a fair fight," Colin said. "Hells, this isn't a fight at all. This is just me looking like a bully and you like a fool. Nobody's winning anything, here. Do us all a favor and yield." The pink dragon snapped his jaws, once, weakly. Even that feeble movement took all of his strength. Colin could feel his condition clearly with his attention focused on him thus. In addition to misunderstanding my power, I suspect you've misunderstood my motivation. I am not soft-hearted or merciful. I am sparing you because my personal agenda requires you alive, Venomax. It's clear enough that you would consider it kinder for me to just kill you, so let me clarify that you aren't getting that kindness. I would rather not subject you to the humiliation of slapping you around this room until you pass out, but it wouldn't be the first regrettable thing I've had to do. Colin clenched his mental fist, increasing the pressure by another decisive fraction. Venomax tried to snarl, and it came out as a wheeze. Now yield. He really thought, for a moment, that he would have to intensify the pressure to the point of causing injury, or resume the beating. Venomax held out just long enough to make it worryingly plausible. But he did, in the end, manage to inhale enough to force the words out through clenched jaws. I yield. Colin released him, and the dragon gasped, flopping over onto his side. He weakly stirred his wings, panting for breath now that he could freely expand his lungs again. Bones crunched under enormous claws as another dragon stalked forward. "Thank you, husband," Isaroa murmured, dipping her head to him as she passed. He nodded once, reaching out to pat one of her legs when it was briefly in reach. Venomax feebly raised his head at her approach. "Mother!" "Idiot boy!" the Empress roared, and to Colin's bemusement, began pecking him. She repeatedly hammered the pointed tip of her nose down onto Venomax's head, pounding him into the floor. "What did you think would happen? Your father was 100 times the dragon you are, and that man vaporized him. With his mind. Are you stupid?" In fairness to Venomax, he just had the bad luck to be first, Phenorexa commented. It was just a matter of time until she tried something equally dumb. Every dragon in the room with the exception of the beleaguered Venomax turned and hissed aggressively at her. Phenorexa immediately flattened herself to the floor in a posture of submission, neck outstretched and chin pressed to the ground. Colin, as the only one not towering over her, was probably the only one positioned to see her lips still curled in a smirk. "Well, I suppose I'm not to end up as Venomax's consort after all," Imalafine drawled, turning around to head back into her chamber. What a relief, that was a close thing for a moment. Isaroa paused in literally henpecking her son to snarl at her, but the white dragon was already fully about-faced and walking away. Colin heaved a sigh, then coughed. Gods above and beyond, the smell. He was going to have to do something about the state of this place. Maybe he could make Venomax clean it as a punishment duty? Later, he decided. Isaroa had progressed to smacking Venomax with her tail and loudly excoriating his character and intellect while he huddled on the floor with his wings drawn protectively over his head. It didn't seem wise to get in the middle of that. Tiavathyris, catching his eye, dipped her head deeply toward him in acknowledgement. Even in her larger form, Colin could recognize her characteristic smile, small, enigmatic and aloof. Even as he held her gaze, though, it widened subtly. Not in amusement. Her eyes were half-lidded as if in a state of relaxed happiness. Gods and hells. And to think he had expected Imalafine would be the difficult one to figure out. "I'm going out," he stated, to no one in particular. "You all seem to have family business well in hand. I want to stretch my legs and think." "Thanks for the update, Pants," she snapped, turning and sauntering back into her mother's chamber. Colin chose to head back through the library to the ancient city out back. This necessarily took him past Phenorexa, who had not moved from her position in the doorway, though she did lift her head to wink at him as he went by. Yeah, getting out was the best thing by far. It wasn't even noon on his first full day as the head of this family, and Colin had managed to get some degree of personal engagement from each of the 6. He was already exhausted with a lot of them. Some fresh air and exercise would be just the thing to brace himself for more of. This. Not that he didn't also have an ulterior motive. He was mindful, of course, of Imalafine's warnings, and did not take risks. The abandoned city was full of things that looked plenty hazardous to the unwary. Even without stepping foot inside any of the old buildings, because the gods alone knew what might be lurking in there, its architecture by itself provided ample opportunity for injury. The timekeepers had liked terraces and elevated walkways. There were all kinds of things Colin could have fallen off of, or into, were he to dash about recklessly. And that was just the architecture, before countless eons of time, weather, and nature had had their way with this place. Many paths were blocked off by rockslides, overgrowth ranging from slimy moss to colossal tree roots, or even torrents of water. Many of the drops that might have been to a time-stone floor at one point now descended into root-choked darkness, or raging cataracts. Still, there was plenty of clear space to walk even aside from all that. It required picking his routes with great care, and frequently backtracking considerably, but the layout of the city itself actually helped a great deal. Built as it was in tiers around the central lake, Colin could see all of it from any point. Usually, he could also see a viable path to wherever he wanted to go. He had to wonder what was down there in the center. To judge by the way water rushed in and splashed over buildings and roads rather than through intended channels, it had not been a lake when it was built. Colin picked his way along in no particular hurry, occasionally pausing to just soak in the incredible view, or reach back with his senses toward the lair. Even from this distance, he could discern the presence of the 6 dragons within, and even their approximate positions and conditions. Most of them were. He chose to interpret the varying impressions they gave as more or less fine, especially in contrast with that of Venomax, who was stinging both physically and emotionally. Doing this, he also detected Imaralafine reaching out to him with a what? Something magical, probably some kind of scrying spell. Colin knew very little about magic, but it was something cast by a dragon, and so he could sense and interact with it actively. As soon as grabbed hold of the spell, he felt her recognize what he was doing, and it dissipated. Well, it was worth knowing she could do that. Knowing, and watching for. It took him a good hour to wander most of the way around the rim of the valley. He avoided stairs wherever possible. There were a few places where he couldn't progress around various obstructions without climbing or descending, but for the most part he remained roughly on a level with the lair's entrance. This was good exercise, particularly at the forgiving pace he set, steady, but variable enough not to be boring. After the amount of strenuous hiking he'd done over the last year, it wasn't tiring at all. Colin was pretty sure he had more stamina now than he had at this time yesterday, but at the gentle pace he'd chosen it was hard to tell. At some point in the near future he'd have to test that more rigorously, if only because Diavathyrs would make him if he didn't. Rather than going as far as he possibly could, he paused at what he judged a sufficient distance. Partly because he had found a really nice spot, some kind of plaza sticking out over the next tier below like a peninsula. A monument stood in its center, as inscrutable as everything else the timekeepers had left, but still pleasing. It was a simple obelisk rising from a narrower, rounded base, all 8 of its faces inset with colored tameglass. In the late morning sun, they were pretty, but in the dark they would put off a glow that must be absolutely lovely. He'd have to make time to come back here and see that. At some point when he had a dragon's company, or more developed powers, something that would make it less unwise to traverse all this in the dark. Partly because he had promised Diavathyrs, and partly just because it felt good, Colin went through the quick routine of stretches and calisthenics mandated by the Lord Scribe. He didn't remember it all being so easy. Was it just because he was in better shape after his active lifestyle of the last year, or was he already ascending beyond mortal limits? In any case, with that done, he felt more relaxed and calmer, and ready to leverage the reason he'd chosen this spot, far enough from the dragons that nothing he did here would be immediately noticeable to them, but specifically not at the farthest point in the valley he could get from them. Going for the maximum distance would only make them wonder what he was up to, if any happened to notice. Colin paced forward to the very edge of the plaza, bracing his hands against the ancient timestone balustrade and leaning his weight on it, gazing out across the city. The view was stunning from any direction, but this spot was particularly pleasant. It was in direct sunlight, now. Given the height of the surrounding mountain walls, there must be a fairly narrow slice of time in the middle of the day when the city was fully illuminated. Even still, parts were dark enough that the Tameglas glowed from deep shadows, including some that were underwater. Right here and now, fully warmed by the sun and cooled by the spray of a nearby waterfall which cut off the path forward from this plaza, it was extremely pleasant. He just soaked in the ambience for a few minutes, then cast his attention back toward the lair. Vedalshi was off flying somewhere to the north, probably hunting or maybe just stretching her wings. The others were in their respective chambers. Imer Alafine was focusing on something, but not anything that connected her attention to Kaln or this location. Finally, Kaln turned his back on the view, staring down at his own shadow. The angle of the sun made it look short and squat, almost puddled around his feet. Well? Though he wasn't moving, the shadow stretched. Then squirmed, rippled, and suddenly shot forward. It lengthened like pulled clay, quivering as if with exertion, until it finally snapped free, rising up to float in the air before him. "Well, look at you!" the entity exclaimed, cheerful as always. In all of history there have been a mere handful of heroes who have slain an ancient dragon. I think you're the first one who's ever done that and then bagged his wife. Tope continued,